every individual has the right to freedom of expression, and this right shall include freedom to receive and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, or through any other media of his choice. When we're talking about what the areas of concern are, the UN Human Rights Committee expressly stated that it is concerned about arbitrary restrictions in law and in practice on freedom of expression online and offline, including the broad and alarmingly frequent use of internet shutdowns. And I think that's where I want to talk very briefly about the role of the European Union's GSP Plus framework, which I think now has created this additional kind of very concrete, tangible incentive that the government of Pakistan now has to implement the international human rights law conventions that it has signed and ratified.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Digi Pod. My name is Farieha Aziz. Today I am joined by Noorzadeh Raja, who is a human rights lawyer. Previously on the Digi Pod, we have discussed the UN Human Rights Committee's observations with respect to what happened in Pakistan's human rights review, particularly things that were flagged on the digital side, whether it's the firewall, whether it in network disruptions, etc. And we also now have recommendations that the committee has given. And we will be discussing a little bit more. But before we get to those recommendations, Noor, could you first contextualize for the audience what this process was, what came out of it, especially with respect to everything that happened in 2024 and now in 2025, what it is that Pakistan must do to meet some of these expectations?
Thank you so much, Farieha, firstly, for giving me the opportunity to be on the podcast. I think just before we get into what exactly it was that the ICCPR review was, what exactly the committee said, and what the outcomes are for Pakistan, not just in the next 1 year, but in the next 4 to 5 years before Pakistan's next state review by the committee happens. I think that it's very important to contextualize exactly what international human rights law is and to kind of talk about how we as citizens are essentially rights holders under this regime, and to talk about how every government, not just the government of Pakistan, but any government that has voluntarily signed and ratified an international human rights law treaty or covenant then becomes a duty bearer. And with becoming a duty bearer, there are certain very concrete obligations that are enshrined in each human rights law covenant that any government signs on to. So when we're talking specifically about this covenant, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, what this covenant sets out to do is to protect a myriad of civil and political rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom of association. But I think what's incredibly important to our context today is, of course, the right to freedom of expression, which I think constitutes the cornerstone, really, of all civil and political rights that are intrinsic to the meaningful exercise, of any kind of democratic participation and any kind of citizenship in any society that deems to uphold those values. And I think incredibly important just to contextualize this in our present day context, where in Pakistan, of course, we have an ongoing assault on freedom of expression and critical dissent, and it's manifested itself so starkly and so poignantly in terms of the digital space and the way that the rights specifically within that space are being increasingly curtailed and infringed. So before we get into, just what exactly the committee has said in Pakistan's most recent review, I think it is important just to talk about what Article 19 of the ICCPR says, and also to talk about what any reasonable restriction of the right to freedom of expression would entail, because it's very important to, I think, analyze and identify what parameters, the UN Human Rights Committee and the drafters of the ICCPR have kind of laid out before we get into what it is that the committee has said on this occasion. So just very, very briefly, I think I'll touch upon what Article 19 says, and then we can kind of get into how this review happened and what the outcome of the review was. So Article 19, which pertains to freedom of expression, in subsection 2 says that every individual has the right to freedom of expression, and this right shall include freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, or through any other media of his choice. So just to kind of explain that, in layperson terms, what that means is that it includes all forms of expression, including, very, very crucially, expression by the media. So that includes any form of expression by journalists, any form of expression, any kind of critical dissent that is expressed, whether in the digital space or in any other space. So it's a very, very, I think, exhaustive right. And Article 19 and the language of the ICCPR, I think, very clearly and unambiguously explains the scope of that right. But what's very important, I think, also is to look at what Article 19, subsection 3 says, because that talks about what constitutes a reasonable restriction of this right. So what the ICCPR says is that the exercise of this right carries with it special duties and responsibilities, and it may be subject to certain restrictions, but these restrictions are only those that are provided by law and are necessary for the respect of the rights or reputations of others, or for the protection of national security, or of public order, or of public health or morals. And of course, I think this is, there's a lot that's been said in subsection 3. And I think it's also very important then to look at how exactly the UN Human Rights Committee has interpreted this language. Because any treaty or any covenant, I think, has within it certain language that is broad in nature. But if you really want to look at how exactly that covenant has been interpreted by the committees that have been constituted to monitor its implementation, it's very important to look at the language of concluding observations. And that's where Pakistan's most recent review comes in. That's where the terminology in the concluding observations that the committee has put out in November 2024 become relevant and salient. But before we talk about the concluding observations, I just want to very briefly explain what concluding observations are and how exactly that process happens. So in terms of the ICCPR, Pakistan ratified the ICCPR in 2010, and the first review of Pakistan by the UN Human Rights Committee happened in 2017. And the second review happened, as I said, in October 2024, which we've already discussed on this podcast. And as a consequence of that review, the committee then put out what it calls its concluding observations or concluding recommendations, which the state party now has to implement. So in terms of what concluding observations are, they're basically the observations and recommendations that are made by a treaty body after it is considered a state party's report. So as you know, and as you've discussed in the prior podcast, there was a very comprehensive, exhaustive review process where Pakistan submitted its state report. This report was then reviewed by the committee. Then the government of Pakistan had the opportunity to go to Geneva and make oral submissions to the committee about the extent to which Pakistan had implemented the ICCPR. And as a result of that entire review process, which also entailed participation by civil society, which is a really important component, which I'm going to talk a little more about later, the committee then put out, these concluding observations that I think are very comprehensive and very, very exhaustive in nature, because what they're doing essentially, I think, is two-tiered. So what the committee has done is that it's highlighted both the positive aspects of a state's implementation of the treaty, in this case, the extent to which Pakistan has implemented its obligations under the ICCPR, but also what it's done very, very crucially is that it's highlighted areas of concern where the treaty body recommends that further action needs to be taken by the state. So it's in very, very express and very clear terms. It's kind of laid out exactly what the government of Pakistan has done in the last 4 to 5 years that was in line with its obligations under the ICCPR, but very crucially, it's also highlighted where the government needs to do better and what the gaps are and how exactly those gaps can be bridged by the government before its next review. So just talking about very, very specifically what the government has said about Pakistan's, So just talking very briefly about what the UN Human Rights Committee has said about the government of Pakistan's implementation of Article 19 in relation to freedom of expression and the safety of journalists and human rights defenders, I'm going to break this down into two components. First, looking at areas where the committee has kind of expressed concern and has noted that these are points that the government of Pakistan needs to take into account, but then also looking at specific recommendations that the committee has made. So when we're talking about what the areas of concern are, the UN Human Rights Committee expressly stated that it is concerned about arbitrary restrictions in law and in practice on freedom of expression online and offline, including the broad and alarmingly frequent use of internet shutdowns, such as the internet blackout and social media outage during the May 2023 protests, and the suspension of mobile internet services on the day of the 2024 general election, as well as the blockage of social media platforms and of online content on vaguely defined grounds. Secondly, the committee said that it's also concerned about the chilling effect that criminal defamation laws, blasphemy, sedition, and counterterrorism laws have had on the exercise of freedom of expression by journalists, activists, and human rights defenders. And it cited very, very specific laws, including the Pakistan Criminal Code, various sections of that, the Prevention of Electronic Crimes Act, the Removal and Blocking of Unlawful Online Content Rules 2020-21, the Pakistan Electronic Media Regulatory Authority Amendment Act of 2023, and then various other laws that the committee very, very expressly cited. Then going on to look at recommendations that the committee has now made, and essentially these are recommendations that look at what exactly Pakistan needs to do to bring its implementation of the ICCPR in line with international law and in line with the guidelines that have been laid down by the ICCPR as well as by the Human Rights Committee. And I'll go through these just one by one and talk about the ones that are most relevant, I think, to the assault on freedom of expression within the digital space. So the first recommendation that the committee made is that Pakistan needs to take immediate steps to ensure that everyone can exercise the right to freedom of expression online and offline without interference, including by reviewing or repealing legislation mentioned above, as well as by putting an end to measures that unduly restrict freedom of expression, such as internet shutdowns and the blocking of websites and online resources and ban on social media platforms, and by establishing an independent and effective oversight body to review and monitor decisions regarding internet censorships and throttling and ensure that any restrictions on the exercise of freedom of expression meets the strict conditions outlined in the covenant. Secondly, the committee has stated that the government of Pakistan should refrain from adopting any measure or law that may result in further undue restrictions to the exercise of the right to freedom of expression, such as the use of a nationwide firewall system. So I think it's very clear that the committee has said in very unambiguous terms what exactly would constitute a contravention of Pakistan's ICCPR obligations. And unfortunately, they are all things that the government of Pakistan has done in the last 3 to 4 months and things that it continues to do. So I think what's very clear is by the time the next ICCPR review happens, I think that we will have a very adequate picture of what exactly the committee's recommendations and points of concern during that review are going to look like, because it's said very clearly what constitutes a contravention and infringement of Article 19. And if the government of Pakistan continues to commit these violations, these will be brought up by the committee during the next review. But let's talk a little bit, I think, Farieha, about what happens before the next review, because that will only happen, about 4 to 5 years from now. And there needs to be kind of a follow-up mechanism in the interim.
How seriously you think the government takes these observations and recommendations, because these are obligations. And then if they do not meet them, are there any repercussions?
Okay, so just talking about what happens prior to Pakistan's next state review by the UN Human Rights Committee, which isn't going to happen now for another 4 to 5 years, I think that it's very important and very crucial to talk about what the follow-up mechanism is in the interim. And the UN Human Rights Committee has constituted a very concrete mechanism in order for this to happen. So in 2001, a follow-up procedure was introduced by the committee to monitor the implementation of the concluding observations that are adopted for each country as a consequence of its state review. And what's going to happen essentially after this state review is that the committee is going to select 3 to 4 priority recommendations from the recommendations that it's included in the concluding observations. And it is going to request Pakistan to submit a follow-up report on the measures adopted nationally to implement those recommendations 1 year after the review. So essentially in 2025, the committee is going to write to the government of Pakistan asking it to provide an update on how exactly it has sought to improve its implementation in relation to the priority recommendations that the committee has identified. And I think that this is an incredibly, incredibly important mechanism because what it also does is that it brings in an opportunity for civil society and NGOs to step in because NGOs also have the opportunity to submit follow-up reports to the committee. So when the government is writing to the UN Human Rights Committee to talk about steps that it's taken to improve implementation with priority recommendations, at the same time, NGOs and civil society that are working on issues related to freedom of expression are also then going to have the opportunity to make submissions to the UN Human Rights Committee to provide any additional information or to highlight any gaps that still remain in Pakistan's implementation, which I think is a very, very crucial mechanism because it gives the committee a more comprehensive kind of view of the situation on the ground in Pakistan. And it's not really taking the committee, at its word, so to say. So I think it's a very crucial mechanism in that way.
Thank you, Noor, for that overview. So like you also said that there are certain things that have been laid out and the recommendations are very specific. And now the onus is on the state of Pakistan to now follow up, right, and implement some of these things. Now, but we are seeing that a lot of the recommendations that have been made rather than implementing those, the government is still following down the same path of actually not reviewing the law. So, for example, PICA, but actually amending to make it worse. So, if we still go down this path, and how seriously do you think that the government even takes these recommendations, which is actually an obligation upon them? And if they don't follow through, whether it's in the interim or when we come up for the next review, are there any repercussions for Pakistan?
I think that that's an excellent question. And I think that it's particularly pertinent because, as you said, the ongoing crackdown on freedom of expression and critical dissent, I think, is only exacerbating by the day. And I think that, as you said, it's very, very important then to talk about what exactly is the role of international human rights law and the role of these monitoring bodies that have been set up to kind of enforce compliance with the obligations that governments like Pakistan have taken on to implement. And I think that's where I want to talk very briefly about the role of the European Union's GSP Plus framework, which I think now has created this additional kind of very concrete, tangible incentive that the government of Pakistan now has to implement the international human rights law conventions that it has signed and ratified. Because essentially, I think what the GSP Plus framework does is that it gives developing countries like Pakistan a special incentive to pursue sustainable development and good governance and the implementation of human rights frameworks. And since Pakistan is a beneficiary of the GSP Plus, it's important to, I think, emphasize that the GSP Plus doesn't create a mechanism of unconditional aid. It is very much conditional and kind of predicated on the fulfillment of Pakistan's international human rights law obligations. So there are specific conventions that the GSP Plus regime monitors, and these conventions relate to human rights, labor rights, the environment, good governance. And I think salient amongst these conventions is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or the ICCPR. And that, I think, is one of the main conventions that the European Union looks at when it is reviewing Pakistan and monitoring Pakistan's compliance with its GSP Plus obligations. So what I do want to talk about just very, very briefly is the fact that Pakistan's last GSP Plus assessment report did explicitly raise freedom of expression, freedom of press, and freedom of association as priority areas which continue to be of concern to the European Union. So I think it's very important to emphasize then and contextualize that, and say that all of the ongoing kind of crackdown and clampdown on free speech, whether it's the firewall, whether it's the restriction and regulation of certain kinds of content online, any kind of blanket ban, any kind of blanket restriction, insofar as it contravenes the ICCPR, is also then in contravention of Pakistan's obligations under the GSP Plus regime. And I think it's important to talk about the fact that the GSP Plus framework has a very robust mechanism for monitoring, which it does on multiple levels. So the current GSP Plus status, which Pakistan is beneficiary of, along with other developing countries, is valid only until 2027. So what that means is that before 2027, there's going to be another very, very comprehensive kind of review mechanism where the European Union Parliament and the European Union Commission are going to examine the extent to which the government of Pakistan has implemented all of the conventions that it has undertaken to implement. And I think it's very important then, to kind of also raise the fact that there have been countries in the past that have lost their GSP Plus status as a consequence of human rights violations that have been committed. So Sri Lanka had its GSP Plus privileges stripped in 2010 and only got them back in 2017, up until the point where it kind of undertook to improve its implementation and compliance with international human rights law commitments. Similarly, Cambodia was completely stripped of its trade benefits and never managed to get them back. So I think it's very important to recognize that there are very, very concrete implications and repercussions that are associated with any beneficiary country of the GSP Plus, which completely, I would say, disregards the obligations that it has undertaken to, kind of fulfill. And I think just to kind of, wrap up this conversation, that I think brings me back to the starting point of this conversation where I spoke about how the government of Pakistan is a duty bearer under international human rights law. What the GSP Plus regime has done is that it's essentially made those duties and obligations, it's now essentially tied them to a very concrete financial incentive. So I think the stakes have been raised to a very great extent.
Thank you, Noor, for this overview. It's been incredibly helpful. And I think it needs to be underscored that this is not just something that voluntarily has to be done. This is an obligation. It is mandatory, and it is tied to some very tangible things like the GSP Plus, which perhaps the government may care more about than perhaps rights that are enshrined, although that is something that should matter. And if we continue to go down the path that we are, and we keep going from bad to worse, which is seemingly what is happening, then we do stand to lose as a country, and we are already losing as people. And the recommendations have been very specific. Today's podcast, we discussed a lot along the lines of the process and freedom of expression, but even with respect to privacy, there are a lot of recommendations and observations that were made, and are now up to the government to see how they want to chart their way forward on the implementation. This is all that we have on the Digi Pod today. Thank you for joining us.